Oh,
Hello.
thank you for coming on. This is part of a podcast series that I put together to bring information to people who are attempting at, I guess, correcting some of the problems that we're faced with and just making adjustments to lifestyle and ways of thinking and being in the world. That can hopefully bring us more into alignment with where we ought to be taking things. And this podcast series is dedicated to the 13th gate, and it's all about where we want to go from here. So today we're going to be speaking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and kind of, I guess bringing some information forward that would allow people to be a bit more discerning, to understand the history of it, just to kind of get an overall general grasp of what it is and where it comes from, because I think there's still a lot of confusion. Many people aren't familiar with what it's all about. So thank you for coming on, and perhaps we can dive right in and you can share a little bit on the history of Bitcoin.
Sure. So I'm not a professional in the industry or anything like that. I'm an amateur who's really interested in it. The idea of digital money has existed for a really long time, decades really. There were a couple attempts at it in the 90s from some corporations and one that was kind of more independent. None of them really took off. The real thing that was the problem is that people wanted the money to be fungible. You hear a lot about non-fungible tokens today, NFTs, but really for a cash, you want it to be fungible. The idea that any one could be exchanged for any other. So like $1 is the same as any other dollar. And at the beginning of the idea of creating a digital currency, it was important that it be fungible, that every dollar be exchangeable for another. But at the same time, you wanted to track it, and you didn't want there to be able to be duplicates of it. So you're kind of walking a thin line there, because you don't want to be able to just create dollars out of nothing like happens in the fiat system, but you also want any $1 to be worth the same as any other dollar. So there was a group of guys called the cypherpunks, and they were basically on internet forums for a really long time discussing the idea of creating this digital currency. There are a lot of those guys out there. There's one guy that created the company Swan Bitcoin. He's kind of a prominent name today. He's created basically a banking service where they take an extract from your checking account once a week or once a month, and they buy Bitcoin with it and put that into a Bitcoin account for you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of a third-party service for stacking sats. I'll talk about what that means. Automatically without having to do anything. He was one of the prominent cypherpunks that is still really visible today.
Okay.
The most important one, though, was a guy called Satoshi Nakamoto, or maybe not a guy. It could have been, it's a pseudonym on an anonymous board, right? So it could have been a group of people. Nobody really knows who it is. Several people have stepped forward to pretend that they are him. I don't believe any of them personally. There's even a documentary now called Finding Satoshi or something like that, about a journalist that interviewed all the different guys claiming to be Satoshi, and he made a documentary about them. There's an Indian guy, there's an Australian guy. The truth is nobody knows, but that's the guy or the group that created Bitcoin. The only real clue that we do have is the very first Bitcoin that was produced had a clipping from a newspaper in it. And it was one of the London newspapers, I don't know, maybe the Financial Times of London. And it was talking about the bailouts that were happening in 2008, which is a clue to the purpose of Bitcoin and digital currency. And the point is that it was always intended as a weapon against the central banks, something to bring down the cheating system of fiat currency. And so the very first Bitcoin ever minted, well, it was many Bitcoins. It was 50 Bitcoins, I believe. I believe at the beginning, 50 were minted at a time. And Just to say, I'm not perfect about this. You might hear little, if you're a professional Bitcoiner, you might hear small inaccuracies or something like that. I'm not really concerned with being technically perfect. I'm more of a I'm more of somebody who helps the lay people understand how it works. And no layperson is ever going to have 100% technical accuracy, and they don't need it. They need to understand the fundamentals. So you might hear me say things that are slightly inaccurate. For the most part, you won't. I don't know how many Bitcoins were minted at a time, though I believe it started with 50 per block. But in that block, there was a message related to the bailouts of 2008. And again, it's a clue to the point of Bitcoin, which is fiat currency is controlled by a select few group of bankers. There's no rules. They can create any amount that they want at any time. And every time that they do that, it devalues the currency for everybody else. So Bitcoin was designed to be the opposite of that. There's a hard cap on 21 million. There can never be more unless the core programmers change that, but they probably won't, because the core purpose of Bitcoin is to be deflationary instead of inflationary, that there will always be less than supply. So I've gone and talked for quite a bit there. I want to give you the opportunity to talk as well.
Thank you. Yes. There's a lot in there, and I'm not sure what to poke at for better understanding, but perhaps like maybe if you can just dive quickly into the history of like the central banks, not, going into too much depth, but just like in general, kind of how it was set up, whatever information you could bring forward on that, I think would be helpful for people that are still catching up on that topic.
Right. So the central bank system is a rigged game. I think more or less everybody in the world knows that at this point. It was set up by a small number of extremely wealthy and powerful families that everybody's heard of. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies. There's a bunch of other famous families that are involved in that. And they set up a system of private banks, and they slowly worked their money into the governments of all the world and convinced the governments through corrupting the politicians. They convinced the governments to set up what they call central banks or reserve banks. And the reserve banks are basically beholden, to these central banks in a kind of feudalistic system like the Middle Ages. So the central banks, they issue dollars, and instead of worth, they're basically issuing debt. So they create dollars, they create as many as they feel like they need at a given time, and they give it to the central banks of the government at interest. It could only be 0.5% or something like that. I don't know what the value is, but the point is that for every dollar that is created and given to the banks then owe the central banks. The federal banks then owe the central banks money back. So for every dollar created, more debt is created than value. And that's intentional. It's a way of keeping everyone subservient to them, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone always owes them money, from the federal banks of the government all the way down. Now, the federal banks, they take the money from the central banks and they loan it to the massive corporate banks, again at interest, but at a much lower rate than everybody else. And all of those huge banks then engage in what we call fractional reserve lending. And to put it real quickly, basically for every dollar that they possess, they can lend out $100 or $1,000. It's really become ridiculous at this point. I don't know what the ratio is. Mm-hmm. But they lend out way, way more money than they actually possess. And they do it according to the theory that because everybody's paying them back on, monthly installments or whatever it is, that the money will always balance out. Because keep in mind that they're paying back the federal banks then, which are paying back the central banks this whole time. So there's a continual chain of debt that is always over leveraged at every step of the way down until it hits the final suckers, which are you and me, if we partake in the credit system in any way. right? Which is basically impossible at this point. So even if you're not living on credit and over leveraging your own income, like almost everybody in North America is doing, at least, you're beholden to institutions that are doing it anyway, like your life insurance company, your medical insurance company, your 401k, your retirement plan, your employer. They're all engaged in the system. And you're at the mercy of all of those systems, really, because at any moment, if your bank goes out of business, if you have a mortgage, your bank can go out of business through no fault of your own. You could lose your house. Your employer can go out of business because they're engaged in this kind of risky business, and you could lose your job, and so on and so on. And because the system is so utterly rigged and so utterly over leveraged, what you end up having is a cycle of boom and bust. And it always comes back to a crash. And the crash always affects everybody, but it always hurts us more than anybody else. And every single time this happens, they tighten the belt just a little bit further, and they ensure that more and more property ends up at the top end of the scale. So they'll say, oops, it looks like we're getting into trouble. Everything's becoming very tight. There's not enough money to lend. It looks like we need to issue 2 trillion fresh dollars into the system. And they give that to the big banks at the smallest possible interest. And that means the big banks have the first crack at every single thing on the market, whether that be gold or silver or properties or utilities like electric companies. And the big banks take their fill. They buy every single thing that they can, while they continue letting the money flow down at higher and higher interest until it reaches us. And we pay for everything by having way outsized interest compared to everybody above us at every level of the ladder, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I guess this brings me to the question of how, when they, like with the inception of Bitcoin, they were trying to create a system, like a parallel system that would bypass the slavery fiat system. And how exactly were they planning on doing that? Like what differentiates the two, and why would it be possible to have a system that, isn't functioning based on the same principles as the centralized system is?
So here's the critical thing that makes Bitcoin really interesting. The main thing is that it's run by code entirely. All of the critical functions happen automatically according to the code, with no need for any kind of intermediary like a bank. Although it is absolutely possible to have banks that deal in Bitcoin, obviously, but they're not required. In the central fiat system, there's only one way to get new dollars. They're created by this cabal of bankers at the top, totally at the discretion of those bankers. Those are a small collection of human beings making that decision. The way Bitcoin works, on the other hand, is programmatic. And Bitcoin produces a new block roughly, I forget if it's every 1 minute or every 10 minutes. I believe it's every 10 minutes, but it could be 5 or 1 minute. So every 5 or 1 or 10 minutes, there's a new block created. And with that block, there is a set amount of Bitcoin that is minted, freshly minted Bitcoin that didn't exist before, into the system. It started at 50 Bitcoin per block. And every 4 years, there's a halving where the amount of fresh Bitcoin is divided by half. So when Bitcoin became 4 years old, it went from 50 to 25 Bitcoin minted automatically. So yes, it was definitely 50 at the beginning, because we've had 4 halvings right now, I believe. No, we haven't yet. We're about to in 2 years. So we've gone from 50 to 25 to 12.5, which is the current amount of Bitcoin that is produced every new block. And next it will be 6.25. So we've had 3 halvings already. We started with 50 Bitcoin, then 25, then 12.5. Now we're at 6.25. That means the next halving, which should happen, I believe, in late July in 2024, there will be 3.125 Bitcoins produced with every block. And the permanent supply can never exceed 21 million. That means there's a constriction of the supply all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very intentional. It's the opposite of the fiat system, which has no limit and can be created at any time at the whim of human beings. It behaves much more like a valuable commodity, like diamonds or gold. One can argue that diamonds are not really valuable and that the supply is artificially limited. But the point is that there will only be a certain amount of diamonds that ever exist. There will only be a certain amount of gold or oil that ever exists. And over time, there will be less and less until there isn't any more. So Bitcoin is designed to act the way that gold or oil acts instead of the way that fiat money acts. And fiat money used to be backed by gold and later silver. So it was pegged to real world value and is no longer. So that was an intentional choice by the cypherpunks to make Bitcoin act like real money, the way that money was supposed to be, before these cheating pigs took control of the whole monetary system.
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of boil it down to, people that don't even understand like what a Bitcoin is. I think that was like the really, really basic stuff is a bit more daunting because, it's like once you grasp the really basic stuff, then it's easier to grasp these bigger concepts. So could you describe what exactly a Bitcoin is?
Sure. A Bitcoin is intended to be real money, a real unit of value, with a limited supply, with a continually constricting supply, that there are fewer and fewer that can be produced. And you could say in the end of the day that it's just a number on a screen, but that's all that a dollar is too, right? They don't even bother to print at the beginning because they're just creating a number on a screen at the central bank and loaning it to the federal bank in that way. And there will never even be as many physical dollars in the world as there are that number on the screen, because that number on the screen is just a number. It's not backed by anything. As I've repeatedly tried to hammer home, they can be created in limitless supply at any time on the whim of these people that control the central supply, right? So a dollar is truly just a number on a screen. As much as people want to say that Bitcoin is only a number on a screen, a dollar is truly just a number on a screen, backed by nothing, limited by nothing, created out of nothing, at the discretion of a very small group of people who control everything, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bitcoin, it may just be a number on a screen, but it has very tight, immutable rules about the way that it's produced. It cannot be created by anyone. It can only be created by the algorithm, and only in a fixed supply, and only according to limited rules. Every time a new block is created, new Bitcoin are created. Now, go ahead.
I was just going to ask what guarantees that the Bitcoin exists. What allows us to know that it exists? It's this decentralized kind of network of computers that are maintaining the integrity of it, right?
Exactly, and that's the critical part. So when people say, "What is Bitcoin backed by?" That's what it's backed by. It's backed by a massive consensus network that is among the most difficult to hack things that we've ever created, that mankind has ever created. It has never been hacked so far. It's existed since late 2008. So we're going on 14, we're into the 14th year, and it has never been hacked so far. Essentially, you have a peer-to-peer network, which is kind of the same idea of a BitTorrent or a Napster for those that are older. It's a system where instead of what we call a client-server arrangement, when you connect to a website, Your computer is the client and the website is held on a server. There's a computer somewhere in the world holding that information. You punch in an address into your URL. There's kind of a phone book service on the internet that we call DNS, domain name service, that looks up that address and it tells you which computer in the world is holding that information. And then your computer calls directly to that server and the server shows you the website. That's what we call a client-server arrangement. This is called a peer-to-peer, in which everybody involved is both a client and a server at the same time, and you're all connecting directly to one another. So it's not a hierarchical network, it's more of a mesh network where everybody's connecting to everybody. And what are we doing? So we have a blockchain, which is a distributed ledger. You think of a normal ledger like an Excel sheet or like a notepad at the corner store where you write down everything that is bought and sold. But this ledger is distributed. So it means that every participant in Bitcoin has a copy of the ledger. And they're all checking all the time to make sure that their copy is the same as everybody else's. And now you have hundreds of millions of witnesses that are all checking all the time to make sure that their ledger matches everybody else's ledger. So every 10 minutes, you have a new block produced. And that's another thing that is done by consensus. That's effectively the, I don't know if you want to say that there's a periodicity to it. It's like the close of business day at the corner store is the block. And there's a new block produced every 10 minutes. So what is a block? A block is a list of all the transactions in the world on the Bitcoin blockchain that happen within 10 minutes. Doesn't matter if there would be 1 or 10,000, they're all bundled together into a list at the end of the 10 minutes. That new block is passed out to the blockchain. So every person that is mining, you've heard the term mining, and it's a lot less esoteric than it sounds. You have every computer on the network that is a miner. They all grab the new blockchain with the newest block at the top of the chain. The blockchain is just a chain of these blocks, and each block is just a list of transactions. So the newest block is created, is passed out there, and every computer on the network, they're first asking, do I have the longest blockchain? If the answer is no, then they grab the longest blockchain because that means there's a new blockchain with a new block on it. So they're grabbing the longest blockchain, which means the most current. And now this newest block is encrypted. There's a cryptographic function called a hash, which we don't need to get into too much depth, but it's basically multiplied by a very huge prime number. A prime number is a number that is only divisible by itself, like 17. Like you can only do 1 and 17. There's no other factors for that. So they take a much, much bigger prime number. They multiply all the zeros and ones of the block. And then there's a huge number. And every miner that has that block are trying to guess that huge number. So in a sense, it's like a lottery, except you have unlimited guesses until you get the number. Free. I mean, except for the large electricity bill that you're paying for the huge computing power to get as many guesses as you can possibly get. So it takes a lot of guesses, which means it takes more and more computing power. And the more people that are part of the blockchain, the harder the math they use. It automatically adjusts to be harder and harder the more people are involved, and the contrary as well. So if people start dropping out of mining, the math becomes less complicated. It becomes easier to solve. So you essentially have hundreds of millions of computers that are saying, do I have the longest blockchain? Yes. Okay, is it X? No. Do I have the longest blockchain? Yes. Okay, is it Y? No. So they keep checking to see if they have the most current block. And if they do, they try to guess the hash value of the block. And when they're able to guess the hash value, that means that they've validated the block. They are the person that gets the privilege of minting the new Bitcoins. And then a new block comes, and there's a new hash, which includes a value derived from the blockchain at all times. so that you know that it's not a fake block passed in. It always has to be consonant with the blockchain, the real blockchain that everyone's validating. And all of this happens very fast, every 10 minutes. So somebody validates the block, they pass it out to everybody else, and they say, here's the new block. And the newest block, once it's created, gets put on the front of that. Now we have a new longest blockchain with a new hash, with part of its value derived from the existing blockchain. And now everybody starts guessing again. So this is very complicated, and I may not be describing it in the most precise possible terms, but I'm trying to describe it in a way that hopefully anyone can understand. And this is a very good approximation of how it works, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say that I've understood this. You explained this to me previously another time, and so I have a basis. I think when you're hearing it for the first time, it's kind of complicated and complex. So my question would be regarding like what you're discussing about building the blockchain and then mining the new Bitcoins and all of that. So it's basically for people who have computers in their home and are participating in the decentralized like mesh network to maintain the Bitcoin integrity. So for people who aren't necessarily going to be having like an external hard, CPU setup to do that type of work with Bitcoin, and they're just using Bitcoin because they have a Bitcoin wallet. I think there's like a differentiation there that needs to be made for people who aren't going to be participating in Bitcoin in the same way that you're describing. Could you clarify that?
Yeah, so there's two different types of node, broadly speaking. There's a full node and there's a light wallet. And the full node contains the entire transaction history of Bitcoin from 2008. Now this isn't, as believe it or not, it's not even a full terabyte yet, I believe, after 14 years of being online, because all they're doing is recording these transactions. So it's a very small amount of information. Eventually, someday, 100 years from now, it may be quite a large thing, but it's not even a terabyte right now, I believe. But it is the entire record from the very first day, and it's designed that it will always be that. So the full nodes will always contain the entire record from the first transaction up to the current day. Those people, generally speaking, are mining. They're also trying to guess the hash value. They don't have to, though. You could have a full node without being a miner. And the full node requires a little bit of memory, a terabyte. The mining requires that you have very powerful CPU. That's what it used to be. And these days, it's all graphics cards, because graphics cards are usually more powerful because they're very restricted to a certain set of things. They're really restricted to a certain kind of math. They don't have to understand how to run the operating system of your computer and be general purpose to run all different kinds of programs. They just are restricted to a certain kind of math. Mm-hmm. So they're much, much faster at that thing. So most commercial miners these days are using graphics cards. Then there's even another kind of card called an ASIC, which is a chip very specifically designed to do literally nothing else but this. And those are the most efficient, and they're very expensive. But I think at this point, even many commercial miners are actually using graphics cards. But all they're doing is just guessing over and over and over again, just guessing, trying to get that hash number. That's all they're doing.
And they
like a lottery.
They receive a reward for it. That's the whole purpose, right?
Yeah. The point, though, is that it's very hard to guess that number. And it takes a lot of guesses. So it takes very expensive hardware. In fact, it takes clusters of hardware. Nobody can get a Bitcoin from their home computer. People join up together into what are called pools. And it's essentially like a lottery pool. Everybody puts in their little $10. And if anybody gets the next block, it's divided equally to everybody in the pool. So it's well beyond the point where an individual could even really mine by themselves. Everybody joins up into pools and they split the shares. That means there are high stakes for this involvement. You need expensive equipment and you need to run it constantly. And there are hundreds of millions of people validating all these transactions. That is what makes it so hard to fake any transactions. And that's what gives it its value. That's what's backing it. It's basically electricity and math is what's backing Bitcoin, you know?
So what would you say? I've heard concerns about the amount of energy that it consumes. And as this, trickled down through the good old telephone, the good old telephone game, there were kind of these misconceptions that it was actually, mining, like literally mining. Bitcoin was literally about mining. And I think it came from that concept of, misconstrued understanding about the energy consumption that's required. What would you say in regards to that? Like, what is it comparable to? Is it something that is worth worrying about? Like if this system were to grow and sort of take over globally?
No, I think it's basically propaganda by central bankers who own everything, including all the media. So Bitcoin mining requires, you often hear these sensational headlines about how it takes more energy than an entire little country or whatever, which is the truth. However, it takes maybe a third or even a fourth of the energy by the traditional money system. Have you ever in your life heard anybody say that the traditional money system uses too much energy and it needs to be stopped?
No.
Well, it's 3 or 4 times what Bitcoin mining takes. And a lot of other things, like, for example, tumble dryers. Like after you wash your clothing, you put it into a tumble dryer. If you take all the tumble dryers in the world, it's, I don't know, 5, 6, or 7 times the energy of Bitcoin mining. And the payoff for all of this energy consumption is the most secure system in the world, right? That's what you get for this energy consumption. It's not nothing. You get a system that is so far unhackable, right?
So you're making transactions. They don't have to go through any central banks. The integrity of those transactions are being upheld by this decentralized network, peer-to-peer network of people that are recording everything. And what makes it possible? Like, what would make it possible to continue to proliferate? And like, what are we missing in terms of if people, obviously awareness about, why we'd want to separate ourselves from the centralized banks, and then how could that be possible? Because I know right now with Bitcoin, and you might want to make a distinction between Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and how basically, like, if we were to separate, and how can we get, because Bitcoin right now can only provide us with certain services. Like, we can't live off Bitcoin entirely because we still have to go through these centralized banks in order to withdraw cash and that sort of thing. So what would it require for us to completely make the switch and remove that middleman central bank and just, be peer-to-peer?
That's a really awesome question. I just want to make one more point about the energy consumption thing, because it's really interesting, especially for those people that are concerned about energy consumption. And they say, so what if fiat takes more energy? It's still a lot of energy. Well, Bitcoin is also the biggest source of green energy on the face of the earth. Bitcoin is more green than any country and more green than any corporation, meaning a higher proportion of the energy used to make it is recyclable green energy, from far, far higher than any corporation or country in the world. And why that's possible is that in the normal energy system, people forget electricity is a current, right? You can't just fill a pool with it or something. Well, you kind of can, there's batteries, but even batteries are very wasteful. So electricity tends to like to move. And no matter how you produce energy, whether you're burning coal, whether you're using geothermal heat or whatever, there's loss. There's always loss. And then there's further loss at where you have your distribution centers, where you have these huge areas where energy kind of pools so that they can distribute it to multiple cities in the region, for example. There's loss at every step of the way. And until now, there has never been any way to recover that loss because there was no need for energy at that spot. There was nothing you could possibly do with it that would make sense. Bitcoin is finally the first thing that makes sense because you can put your Bitcoin mining operations literally anywhere. So now people are putting their Bitcoin operations right on top of energy distribution centers, right on top of hydroelectric dams and that kind of stuff. And all of the energy that would have been lost historically is now used for Bitcoin mining. So Bitcoin mining is actually harnessing loads of energy that would have been lost forever. And right now it's a huge proportion of the energy used to mine Bitcoin, and far, far greater than anything done by any country or corporation in the world. Now on to your other question. Why do we want to get away from these blood-sucking vampires that can that can generate trillions of dollars out of thin air at any time, devaluing everything that you own, everything that you worked for, your house, your retirement plan, all of it becomes valueless because they're just pumping fake money into the system whenever they feel like it. And then when it becomes, everything you own becomes valuable and you're forced to sell the remainder of what you have just to stay afloat, they buy everything and then they go back to business as usual. Why do you want to get away from them?
No, the question was, how do we make, well, first, let me just, I guess, ask you about can you explain the difference between Bitcoin and cryptocurrency? Because I know that the central banks have started setting up their own cryptocurrencies. So I think people need to make that distinction, right? So maybe you can just explain the difference between Bitcoin and cryptocurrency.
Okay, yeah, this is an important one because there's a lot of people saying ridiculous things right now. Bitcoin is the canonical cryptocurrency, right? Most of the altcoins are also cryptocurrency. I mean, they're a currency that's based on an algorithm which includes cryptographic hashing. It's that simple. You have a block, they hash the block, and therefore it's a currency backed by crypto, right? A lot of people are out there, they want to make a distinction between Bitcoin and all the rest of those currencies, which are typically called altcoins. Even Ethereum is an altcoin. Some people would say it's not. Some people would say Bitcoin and ETH are the main things and everything else is an altcoin. It makes sense to call everything else an alternative coin because Bitcoin has, I want to say, 48% value of the entire market is all in Bitcoin. So it's the clear dominant force, way bigger than everything else. So it makes sense to call everything else an altcoin, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to say that none of the others are really cryptocurrency. And then you hear the even more ridiculous claim that Bitcoin is not a cryptocurrency. And that's usually said by people that don't really understand any of this, and they want to draw a distinction between Bitcoin and all of the other altcoins. Bitcoin absolutely is a cryptocurrency. It's the first and it's the canonical cryptocurrency. That mechanism that we talked about for validating and minting new coins, we call proof of work. That's the name of the algorithm. And that's how we draw a basis. You know, the value that backs that number on the screen is math and electricity. A lot of other coins do not use proof of work. They use a different algorithm called proof of stake. And in that case, there may not be a cryptographic function underlying it. Instead, you have a set monetary value that you deposit and you lock into the chain. And then you get rewarded often based on the amount of value that you're locking into the chain, which makes sense economically. When you lock value into the chain, you increase the value of the currency. And that means you're a bigger stakeholder and you get a bigger reward for being the person locking the value into it. There's a really important distinction though. Proof of stake is not secure. It's not as anywhere near as secure as proof of work, right? And this is why you have all of these people engaged in this coordinated narrative attack against Bitcoin for its energy consumption, because what they're really doing is they're attacking proof of work because they don't like it that they can't interfere with Bitcoin, right? So they're attacking proof of work by attacking the energy consumption of Bitcoin. Proof of stake requires very little energy because all you do is you have a bunch of people locking money into the system, and then you have the system itself. Often there's different ways of approaching it, and every coin, not every coin is different. Many of them are clones of each other, but there are different ways of handling it, and often it could be that the system itself is saying, okay, it's your turn, now it's your turn, now it's your turn. So there is no need for this massive energy output. It's basically a lottery, a centralized lottery, usually randomized. Sometimes instead of randomized, it's a direct mathematical function of how much money that you're contributing. But it's way less energy costs, and as a result, it's way less secure. It's much easier to hack. And you see hacks of Ethereum and all their altcoins all the time, every couple of weeks,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what are the centralized cryptocurrencies on the market right now?
Well, Ethereum is highly centralized. A lot of them are centralized. Some people argue that Bitcoin is centralized, in that the huge mining pools, there's only a couple major, I don't know how many, maybe less than 10 massive mining pools. The important thing is that none of those massive pools are 51% of the network.
Mm.
So Bitcoin is largely decentralized. There is no majority player. There may be other coins out there that are more decentralized than Bitcoin. There probably are some. Ethereum is way less decentralized. And there are many companies out there that start their own coin and they're not decentralized at all. There are many companies where they basically own all of the nodes themselves, and other people can stake currency to get rewards, but nobody else owns a node. Either nobody can own a node, or the incentives for owning a node are not strong enough and nobody bothers. So they're not decentralized at all. They're basically owned entirely by one company. Some of the other alternatives out there, alternatives to Ethereum, like Polkadot, for instance, Cardano, those are probably more decentralized, but I don't really know that. I would have to look into it.
Mm-hmm. So Bitcoin, so when you said 50, as long as 51% is maintaining the integrity because it's peer-to-peer, it's not being upheld by any, I guess, supercomputers that are owned by the government type of thing, then it's still decentralized. But from what you explained, I guess anyone who is doing the mining, if it is a government institution that says, okay, we're going to start mining Bitcoin, then technically they have control of it as long as they don't have over 51%. As long as they're not doing over 51% of the mining. Is that correct?
Once you achieve 51% control of the mining, it's not a guarantee. It's a precondition, though. Once you achieve that amount of dominance, it becomes possible that you could defraud the system. And like I said, it's not a guarantee. It's merely a precondition. It's still hard to defraud the system if you only control 51% of the nodes, but it becomes mathematically possible. And the higher your percentage of, like if you own 75% of the mining nodes, forget it, you could easily compromise the whole system. So everybody involved fights against that. There was one time that a group achieved 51%. And because that threatens the stability and thus the value for every single person involved, they voluntarily split into two groups.
Because the power becomes too centralized, and then they can easily make changes to the code, or?
Because once you validate a block, you then need the consensus of hundreds of millions of other witnesses all saying, I agree, this block is correct, and we're moving on to the next one, right? Mm-hmm. So if you possess a majority of the nodes, the higher the number of witnesses you have that can all fakely, falsely say, yes, this is correct, you can pass false transactions through the system. And nobody wants that. Nobody that's invested in Bitcoin wants that anyway. The central banks would want that. But nobody that's invested in Bitcoin would want that because it destroys the value for everyone, including themselves, as soon as it's known about. So no true Bitcoin proponent would ever agree to that, not even for themselves.
How would we know like what is our indication to see like who owns what?
So that's one thing we haven't really talked about a lot, and it's an important thing. Because there's a strong misconception that Bitcoin is anonymous. And the truth is that the entire ledger, every single transaction is public from day one. You can go all the way back and you can see every transaction that was ever made. And you can see which wallet it was in and which wallet it went to. The thing is, those wallets have a confusing hash value. So it's just a mixed up combination of letters and numbers. And you don't know necessarily that hash belongs to Mr. Smith versus somebody else. You don't necessarily know who that block belongs to, but there's ways of figuring it out because eventually it will have to come out of the system into a bank somewhere or something like that. Or at least that was the old way of thinking. But that isn't the case. And you asked, how can we get around the bankers? And there are places in the world, for example, Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador, where they run entirely on Bitcoin and it never comes out of the system. So the hope of many in the pure Bitcoin community is that we will see more and more adoption of this kind of thing. And it's happening in a lot of places like Central America and Africa, that entire regions adopt a cryptocurrency and they do bypass the banks 100% and never come back into the old system. Now, in that case, you might be able to operate entirely anonymously, but mostly they're regions full of poor people and they're probably using their cell phone to transact. And then all you got to do is figure out who owns the cell phone that wallet is on. So it isn't true that it's anonymous. It's actually completely public. But with some hard work and knowledge, it's possible to do it close to anonymously. I mean, you have to really know what you're doing. And even then it's risky. If you're worried about being tracked by the best people in the world, like an intelligence agency, it may well be impossible to be completely anonymous from them. But you can do it semi-anonymously if you really know exactly what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. So I think the basic understanding is that in order for any sort of peer-to-peer monetary system to really function well, is that all the businesses in that community, or enough businesses, like a greater percentage of businesses on a variety of different levels, adopt it. So for example, like a grocery store, a gas station, like at least the basics, the fundamentals that we need in order to live, like a farmer, or whatever, different, as long as all those bases are covered and we can pay through like a Bitcoin type currency, then it's possible to live off of it entirely and
that's right.
Bypass the system. So this kind of reminds me of, I just wanted to mention, and I think it was in New York, I might be wrong, I'll have to look up this information, but it's bringing back a memory of, it might have been San Francisco. I know that in one place they had developed, it was actually through an artist collective, But the concept was to create these unique dollar bills. And so there was only one of each. And then they kind of started building their community. So all the artists were able to use these bills with the people that had agreed in that community to accept them.
Yeah.
You remember anything about that?
I've seen a lot of projects like that.
Yeah, so it's kind of the same concept, but on a bigger scale and way more sophisticated and organized.
Well, you'd be surprised. I mean, Bitcoin Beach is a very modest, it's just a little touristy beach community in El Salvador, right? So, and there have been people that have lived only on crypto already for like 10 years. Like from the very beginning, there were some big advocates. Like, I don't remember I want to say Antonopoulos. He's a Greek person that was a very big early advocate of Bitcoin. And he's been living purely on Bitcoin for like a decade. All you have to do is find one vendor for each thing that you need and get them to agree to accept Bitcoin from you. And that's all you can do. So I mean, there's probably people in the middle of downtown Montreal and New York that are living only on Bitcoin and have been for a long time already. But now we're starting to see the adoption of like entire communities that are Bitcoin only, you know?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, any other questions for clearing up sort of misconceptions or just to help people better understand. I think, if someone's embarking on this journey and, the discernment is about, is the technology going to be used for the benefit, right, of the people versus is the technology just going to be used to keep people in this kind of slavery system, like the old fiat system, and then how to discern. And then even if people aren't into the technicalities of how Bitcoin is run and how it works, they can still get themselves a wallet and start using it with vendors and with people that accept it, to kind of just have it going so that if it does take off, because people need to collaborate on this in order for it to take off truly anyway, right?
Yeah.
So what would you recommend for setting up, like, just as a starter? I know that Bitcoin, there's other cryptocurrencies that you recommend as well. What are some of those as well, and how could people just get started very simply, to ensure that they don't get sucked into the cryptocurrencies that the banks are putting out? Because I think CIBC, there were a few banks that already set up their whole cryptocurrency infrastructure. So, if we want to stay separate from all of that and really create something new on the peer-to-peer level, then what are the cryptocurrencies that, that are interesting, and how easy is it to set up a wallet?
So the Bitcoin and Ethereum are the big dominant ones, obviously. They're the ones that will probably survive no matter what happens. We're having like a Great Depression style crash right now. Actually, we had something like this happen in 2015 or late 2014. People have been announcing the death of cryptocurrency hundreds of times in the last 14 years. If it's ever going to happen, I don't think it's going to happen personally. But we're seeing right now the biggest crash we ever had, possibly even bigger than the late 2014 crash. Paradoxically, if you believe in cryptocurrency, that means right around now is the very best possible time to start buying into it, because the price is catastrophically low. For those of us who live off of it, it's catastrophically low. It's not a good time for me, because my income is 100% crypto at this moment, which means that I'm forced to sell at very bad prices to pay my bills. So I'm just trying to lay low and pay the bare minimum on every single thing, rather than be forced to part with, to me, what are valuable assets at a very bad price. So it's a very good time to buy in. the thing is, we don't know where the bottom is. It could go 50% further. It could go 75% further for all we know. But I would recommend buying any time around now if you have extra money that you're comfortable losing. It doesn't matter if it drops another 50%. If you believe in it long term, it's going to go way, way higher than this years from now. So you could either wait until you think you've hit the bottom, or you could just buy now. A lot of people do DCA, what they call dollar cost averaging, DCA, which means you just buy, like, say, $200 worth every week. And then you don't concern yourself so much with whether it's going up or down. You believe in it long term. You buy $200 worth like clockwork every Friday. You win some, you lose some. You know that over time the value will be much higher. I certainly think that's a good approach. And of course, you can opt out at any given moment. You buy 1 week, it falls 75%. Then you say, okay, maybe I'm going to wait out this week. Then you wait till it goes back and you buy another 200. So my point is, buy now, buy, but also be cautioned that we don't know where the bottom is. It could go lower. It could go a lot lower, but it's so low at this point that long term, you're certainly going to make out, no matter, even if it drops a further 75% from here. If you believe in it, you know that it's going to be a lot higher later on. So there's no reason to not buy right now. But if you want to wait for the bottom, that you might get even better, but nobody knows where the bottom or the top is. This might be the bottom right now. So I would say look at buying periodically, regardless of price. It's definitely going to go up over time. If you're not buying Bitcoin and ETH, make sure you understand what you're buying. All of the altcoins, there are many, many of them that are clones of each other. You want to look for utility. Is it a coin that backs up a gaming ecosystem, for example? Then the coin just has utility. Like, you can buy things within a video game. That means there'll be a crowd for that coin all the time. Even when the market is terrible, there'll still be people playing the video game if it's a good video game with a good active user base. If you look at something like Dogecoin, it has literally no utility at all. It's a clone of Bitcoin. It's exactly the same code as Bitcoin, although it's been changed in a couple subtle ways. It's literally just a copy of something else. It's not part of any kind of commercial ecosystem. It's not part of a game. There's no decentralized finance attached to it, so it has zero utility. Dogecoin could be a surprising one because it's backed by people like Elon Musk's crowd and like Vitalik Buterin, who's the creator of Ethereum. They're on the board of directors of Dogecoin, so there could be interesting things that could happen. Like Tesla could say, we'll let you buy a Tesla in Dogecoin, for example. But until then, there's no utility for it. And I don't know what Elon has hinted back and forth that he will accept Dogecoin for certain things. I don't know where the current state of it is now. So that's a weird example. But if you find something else and you can't explain in an easy sentence what is the purpose of this coin, it's probably not a good one to buy.
Well, what is the purpose of Bitcoin?
Bitcoin is the canonical store of value as far as digital assets are concerned. It's digital gold. It's the first mover in the space. Even if somebody else clones Bitcoin, they're never going to have, hundreds of millions of people mining it the way Bitcoin is. So that crowd, you call that the first mover advantage. That's the reason why, even though you can copy any code you want, you're never going to build up that mining and validating community that exists for Bitcoin. So people can clone it all they like. They're not going to become the next Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin has the infrastructure and the mining and validating community in place that will probably never, it's very unlikely that anyone will unseat Bitcoin for number one at this point. So who knows, that could happen in 30 years. But.
So when distinguishing purpose, this is the bringing back to the question that was really what I was asking, if we're looking for purpose, I mean, it can vary depending on the type of cryptocurrency. Like Bitcoin, I think its purpose is different than what you were describing with the gaming. So Like for me, for example, you know, where I see things going, if, for example, all of the banks and the centralized banks are transitioning to cryptocurrency, then it's kind of a race, right? Who's going to do it first? Is it going to be the people or the banks? Like if we all side and we just kind of go ahead with this digitalization of everything into cryptocurrency with the centralized banks, then we're just going to be, you know, continuing in the same direction, but using a new model of transferring money, but not a new model of how the money is distributed and the integrity of it. Whereas if we say, okay, everything's moving into cryptocurrency, let's, you know, put our money and value into the decentralized systems, then we can kind of ensure that the centralized power of those banks slowly dies out, right? So this is where, you know, bringing awareness about what this is to people, and so that they all don't just get sort of sucked into the wave of, like, you know, all of the centralized banks going digital and switching to crypto, and not knowing that there's another option on the side of building up, because we're kind of right at the beginning. And because we're right at the beginning, there's a lot of opportunities, you know, for people to just switch out. So anyway, that's kind of how I see it. And then also in terms of, like, what is the purpose and the value that you were discussing, for me, it would be a lot to do with community, right? Because if you have these NFTs that can build blockchain within these cryptocurrencies, we can, you know, let's say, you know, for example, have a piece of land and people are buying into that project. Like, they can buy into different projects, right, to build up land, like to do, you know, a whole bunch of permaculture on a certain land. And then there could be NFTs associated with that project or with that piece of land, where they invest in, and then in return, they would be receiving, let's say, you know, vegetables from that season, or visits. You know, they'd be able to go camp out on the piece of land, or use the facilities, you know, the lake and stuff like that. So that's kind of where my thinking is, and like, what are the possibilities that we can do with this? I guess all these different communities, like, value and purpose for them will be different.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I have some NFTs, for example, that are fractional ownership of an online casino. So I get revenue from the casino based on the fractional ownership that I have from the NFTs. There could be any kind of thing. There's a lot of NFTs out there that are just a JPEG with nothing. And somehow or another, people were selling these for millions of dollars and everything, but that's rapidly crashed, as it's obvious that it would happen. What you want to find is something with utility beyond itself, you know?
Mm-hmm. So what do you think of models of, like, you know, if the economy is crashing and then people are having to just really focus on basics of survival, you know, without going into survival mode? Like, could it be possible to just create, like, this community-based cryptocurrency that just supports people in the community regarding, like, you know, food and even transportation, or, you know, gas, stuff like that? Sorry about the phone. I'm gonna go close it. Just 1 second. So yeah, do you want to add anything to that? Is there?
No, not really, but of course there's ways to do that, and a lot of communities are doing it already, right? There's probably 1,000 more blockchain projects than anybody on Earth needs right now. 1,000 times more, you know. For every 1,000, one of them is useful, probably.
Mm-hmm. So this is really the beginning stages of us kind of understanding this, and the transition into cryptocurrency is happening no matter what. And then it's really, I think, comes down to whether or not people are going to take it into their own hands to decide if they want to embark on this journey away from the decentralized banks, or if they're just going to continue on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess, as final thoughts, and if you have any comments about, it feels very complicated. I remember the first time I looked at all this stuff, it felt very complicated. I couldn't understand any of it. The second time was a bit easier, and it took a while just to grasp the concept. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of people out there are going to feel the same way, and just have a lot of misconceptions about it, and also feel like it's super complicated. But as a final comment for myself, I just encourage people to speak with someone who knows about it and who can answer the basic questions, and really just demystify it, and boil it down to the bare bones, so that it's not complicated anymore, because that's one of the things that will keep people away from it. If people feel like it's too complicated and they don't understand it, and they just won't want to deal with it, and that's what happens with a lot of things in society that we're looking to change, is people want the change, but then they're not willing to actually just invest the brain power, or even just the time to sit down and understand things.
Yeah.
Why they're beneficial. So I would just encourage people to continue, find someone who understands it, and to not be intimidated by the conversation that we had today, because if you're hearing all this stuff for the first time, it can sound, very complicated, but it's actually not, once you've grasped the basics. So those are my final kind of comments. And is there anything you would like to add as a final commentary on all of this, and just thoughs in general about the world in terms of where things are going in the banking system? I don't know, anything at all, really.
No, really. Thanks for a great conversation, though.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm hoping to inspire people to continue to look into this stuff. It's the final hour. We're here. And as this new cycle begins, if people don't sort of take things more into their own hands with everything, but really, boiling down to like where our money is and what it is, and how we're using it and who's using it and what the whole system is about, then it's going to be really hard to break free from a lot of the constraints that have been holding us back, and that people are looking to change. So thank you so much for coming on and discussing all of this. And if ever you want to set up another discussion further down the line, then let me know. I'll be more than happy to share the podcast space with you.
Awesome. Thanks for talking to me.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.